Well, ahead of the World Economic Forum on Africa, Oxfam has called attention to the crisis of inequality in Africa. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening. And in January, Oxfam said that it's just 8 of the richest people in the world had the same wealth as the billions of people that make up the poorest 50%. Zoning in on Africa specifically, there's also rising inequality, and the figure is alarming.
Well, let's take a look. The top 4 most unequal countries in the world in terms of income inequality are found in Africa. They are Swaziland, Nigeria, Namibia, South Africa coming fourth. Oxfam says in South Africa, 3 billionaires have the same wealth as the poorest half of the population. It has challenged African leaders to champion new economic models that it says will be fit for the future. Well, let's discuss now. We're joined by the Executive Director of Oxfam International and the Co-Chair of WEF Africa 2017, Winnie Byanyima. Ms. Byanyima, thank you for joining us from our Durban studios. Often when this debate comes up, people say, well, maybe the gap between the rich and the poor is wider, but still people have been lifted up out of poverty. There's less poverty. What is the real situation in Africa?
Well, Oxfam has released its report today, and we call that report Starting with People, a Human Economy Approach to Inclusive Growth. In this report, we've looked carefully at the situation in Africa, and we find that actually inequality is much worse than we had thought. You've just cited some figures. And the main message of this report is that the biggest barrier to growth which is really the obsession of our governments, is poverty and inequality. They are putting a brake to growth. Unless our governments tackle poverty and inequality head on, we are not going to see the growth figures that they obsess about. We also show the consequences of this level of extreme inequality and poverty. For example, the fact that although in the last 15 years African growth was high, some of the highest figures of growth in the world were in countries here in Africa, yet in spite of that, since 1990, by 2012, we had 50 million more poor people on our continent. In Nigeria, one of the most unequal countries in Africa and in the world, 10 million children are not going to school in that rich country. 10 million children not going to school. 1 out of 10 children don't live to see their 5th birthday. So the consequences for our people are dire. And we're telling governments here that focus on fighting poverty and inequality, make those central to the economic model. Don't just be preoccupied with high figures of growth that is captured by a few people at the top, as it is in these countries that are so unequal.
Well, you've raised the issue of Nigeria, and I think it's so interesting because you look at Nigeria and Namibia, and they're both among the top 4 most unequal. But you're saying because of the choices they are making, they're going in different directions when it comes to inequality. So it is about political choices.
Absolutely. We've been looking carefully at how these countries are taxing, how do they collect their revenues. We've been looking at how they are spending, and we've been looking at how they treat their workers. And you really do see that for a country like Nigeria, I've just returned from northeast Nigeria, where 47,000 people are living in near famine conditions, and another 5 million are on the brink of starvation in this area of northeast Nigeria. It happens to also be the region that has had least investments from the government. It's the poorest region of the country. It's the most unequal region. And this is where there is the crisis of Boko Haram, and where now you have people starving. So the connections are so clear that the countries that are not taxing progressively, not fighting tax dodging, that are losing a lot of their money through tax holidays and tax breaks, and who are not channeling their revenues into health, into education, and to agriculture, where most of our people work. These countries, we're seeing widening inequality and slowing growth.
What do you say then to South Africa? Because we have a very progressive tax system, but still such resentment about the inequality, and it is extreme. What do you think of our recently announced 45% for the top bracket?
South Africa, like a number of other countries, but more so than the other African countries, has a history of apartheid, colonialism before that, and all these have created this situation of gross, huge inequalities. An economic transformation program has got to pump resources to where people are, has to create jobs for people. South Africa's extractive economy cannot produce enough jobs for all the young people. More money has to go into other avenues, such as more services, agriculture, and other sectors where young people can find the jobs for the future. South Africa also needs to look at tax dodging. There is a lot of money that it's losing through all the various loopholes that companies have created for themselves legally, but through which they avoid paying their taxes. But right across Africa, we are saying that this is not about tweaking the current economic model. It's not going to deliver to the huge numbers of young people, of women who are living in poverty. We need a complete rethink. For example, we say that the business models that we have now, the business people here and the companies they are running, those are not companies that will deliver for our people. We need business models that give value, that share value with producers, with workers, with consumers, and for the whole of society. Currently, the business models we have just pump profits to shareholders, leaving workers with depressed wages. 70% of the working youth in Africa are working in poverty. They are categorized as working in poverty. Why? Simply because they are forced to take jobs that are casual, that are low paying, and that are risky. And the businesses which are there depress wages for even those working in the formal sector. So we're talking about new business models, cooperatives. And you know, cooperatives are tested. Nearly 40% of the population of Kenya, for example, directly benefit or indirectly benefit from cooperatives. Cooperatives work even in rich countries and in poor countries. Social enterprises, these are the kinds of businesses that will spread the benefits of success to more people.
Ms. Byanyima, what do you say to businesses that exist right now, big business operating in Africa? Because this is huge in South Africa. Calls again for nationalization. On the other side, people are saying, but the fact is, the skills and the capital needed to make business work, to create jobs, will then just leave the country. These old models don't work. What do you say to big business and wealthy people who actually want to be part of the solution, not the problem?
Well, Oxfam is not against wealthy people, and Oxfam is not against business. But we want business to do two things. One, big business should pay their fair share of taxes. What we have today in Africa is a situation where big business negotiate governments down to offer them tax incentives, tax holidays. Their corporate tax is so low that governments are forced to shift the tax burden to poor people through indirect taxes such as VAT. In sub-Saharan Africa, 70% of the revenue comes from indirect taxes, VAT, consumption taxes, which actually tax poor people relatively more than rich people. And what does that? There are two consequences of that. One is that poor people remain poor because more is taken out of them. But secondly, they are also denied the services that they would have gotten if big companies were paying their fair share. So governments don't have the money to pay for quality education for the young people, to have the jobs for the future, the skills for the future. Governments don't have money to pay for good health for its citizens because the companies have gotten off without paying their fair share. So it's very important that we rein in the resources that Africa can get from business. So one message to business here is to pay their fair share. Good responsible tax practices. Secondly, business should share profits across. Today, we have an extreme form of shareholder capitalism. Most of these businesses now plow 70% or more of their profits directly to shareholders. That means only a little comes to workers. Workers' wages are depressed. Producers, their prices are held very low. The environment is damaged. It's not replenished. So the kind of capitalism we have, the business models we have, are just sucking out value and channeling it to the owners of capital. We are saying those are not the business models that are going to lift people out of poverty and give everybody a good standard of living.
All right, Ms. Byanyima, I wish we could talk more. This crisis of inequality, such a burning issue in Africa, and Oxfam highlighting that specifically in Africa ahead of the World Economic Forum tomorrow. That was the Executive Director of Oxfam International, Winnie Byanyima.